All right, let's jump right into this explainer. We're looking at a period in American history that's honestly a total paradox, the Progressive Era. From the late 1800s through the early 1900s, the US was completely turned upside down by these massive reforms. But here's the real reason we're digging into this today. This era actually gives us an incredibly effective blueprint for tackling our modern problems, but only if we learn from its fatal, deeply exclusionary flaws. So, here's our roadmap. We're going to quickly cover the industrial crisis, the reform blueprint that followed, and the power of exposure. After that, we'll take a hard look at the era's darker legacy and the voices of resistance before we finally build out an inclusive modern blueprint. Kicking things off with Part 1, the industrial crisis and the absolute chaos of the Gilded Age. To really grasp why these progressive reforms were so drastic, you have to picture the wild, totally unregulated chaos of the late 1800s. I mean, rapid industrialization was a total double-edged sword. Yes, it brought unbelievable tech advancements, but it also fueled these giant corporate monopolies and some truly heartbreaking urban poverty. Take the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire in New York City. 146 garment workers, mostly young immigrant women, died simply because the doors were locked to stop them from taking unauthorized breaks. It was a completely preventable tragedy, and it made the demand for government intervention absolutely undeniable. And the crazy part? That fire was just one symptom of a much larger systemic meltdown. Reformers weren't just fighting a single battle here. They were up against dangerous child labor, which was captured in those famous, heartbreaking photos by Louis Hine. They were battling sprawling monopolies like Standard Oil, fighting horrific, overcrowded tenement slums, and trying to dismantle extreme political corruption run by local machine bosses. It was a systemic crisis. And you know what? A systemic crisis requires a systemic solution. Which brings us to Part 2, the Progressive Reform Blueprint, where the government actually steps in. Faced with all these overlapping disasters, progressives built an absolute arsenal of reforms to rein in corporate power and protect everyday people. The sheer range of tactics they used is wild. On one hand, you had grassroots efforts like Jane Addams's Hull House in Chicago working directly on the ground to help immigrant communities. But at the same time, they were pushing through massive, sweeping constitutional amendments. We're talking the 16th, 17th, and 19th Amendments, which totally expanded democracy and fundamentally changed how the government funded itself. They even brought in antitrust laws, like the Sherman and Clayton Acts, to literally break those corporate monopolies apart. A really huge milestone in this whole era of regulation hit in 1913. Right on the heels of the severe economic panic of 1907, the Federal Reserve Act was passed. This was a game changer. It marked a massive turning point, drastically expanding federal oversight over banks and markets by establishing a central banking system to finally stabilize a super volatile economy. Moving right along to Part 3, the power of exposure and the muckrakers. Now, these big government reforms, they definitely didn't just happen out of nowhere. They were pushed across the finish line by this fearless new breed of investigative journalists called muckrakers, who dragged the rot right out into the open. Writers like Upton Sinclair didn't just give people dry statistics. They gave them visceral, stomach-churning human details. When Sinclair's novel The Jungle exposed the disgusting practices of the meatpacking industry, I mean, when people read about poison rats and spoiled meat literally being shoveled into their food supply, they didn't just ask nicely for change. They demanded immediate, uncompromising action. It created this undeniable action-reaction pipeline. Sinclair publishes his work, the public is absolutely outraged, and the government's back is against the wall, right? They're forced to act, passing the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act in 1906. It's solid proof that getting the truth in front of the public directly forces legislative change. And Sinclair was far from the only one doing this. You had Jacob Riis, photographing the miserable realities of tenement housing, and Lincoln Steffens, exposing municipal corruption. Then there's Ida Tarbell, who relentlessly investigated Standard Oil until that massive monopoly was finally broken up in 1911. These journalists proved that the pen was actually mighty enough to break monopolies and completely rewrite the laws of the land. But we need to shift gears for Part 4, the darker legacy and the exclusionary reality. This explainer really has to take a sharp turn right here, because the exact same era that championed all this democratic reform was simultaneously engineering devastating systemic exclusion. The dissonance is honestly jarring. While so many reformers were fighting to expand democracy through things like direct elections and women's suffrage, that expansion was highly selective. Literally at the exact same time, state and local governments were aggressively institutionalizing white supremacy with Jim Crow laws, legally disenfranchising Black Americans, and putting up walls against immigrants with literacy tests and the Chinese Exclusion Act. It turns out, progress wasn't meant for everyone. And it gets darker. It's tough to talk about it, but it's essential to recognize that concepts like eugenics were widely considered cutting-edge progressive science back then. The horrific idea that society could somehow be improved by forcibly sterilizing marginalized people wasn't just a fringe theory. It was embraced by a lot of mainstream reformers and shockingly upheld by the Supreme Court. It's a really vivid reminder of how the machinery of reform can just as easily be weaponized against the vulnerable. Which leads us directly to Part 5, Voices of Resistance, Fighting for Everyone. Against this incredibly exclusionary backdrop, leaders from marginalized communities fought tooth and nail to make sure progress actually meant progress for absolutely everyone. Black reformers picked up the very same progressive tools, like muckraking journalism, and used them to fight back. Take Ida B. Wells. She was a pioneering investigative journalist who literally risked her life to expose the domestic terrorism of lynching and racial violence in the South. She perfectly embodied that core progressive belief. Exposing the truth is the very first step to forcing structural change. And this resistance? It was highly organized. After the devastating Plessy versus Ferguson decision that basically rubber-stamped legal segregation, leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and Mary Church Terrell kicked off the Niagara movement. By 1909, that movement evolved into the founding of the NAACP. They built their own institutions to mount organized legal and social fights against racial injustice, fiercely demanding the true inclusive democracy that the mainstream progressive movement was totally ignoring. Finally, Part 6, An Inclusive Modern Blueprint. So this all brings us to the core question of our explainer today. How should democracy and reform actually look in a modern industrial society? We have this incredible opportunity to borrow the powerful, effective machinery built during the progressive era, things like government oversight, investigative exposure, and constitutional amendments. But, and this is a massive but, we have to deliberately guide that machinery with the intersectional vision of the marginalized voices who fought its blind spots. The mechanics are sound, but the exclusionary biases of the original architects absolutely have to be thrown out. Think about the historical tools we can use right now to fight our own modern Gilded Age of tech monopolies, corporate power, and insane inequality. We still need serious antitrust action. We still need strong federal oversight for health and safety. We still need relentless journalism to expose corruption. The progressive era proved beyond a doubt that when everyday citizens and bold journalists force the issue, the government can and will step in to level the playing field. So, I want to leave you with this to think about. As we look at the tech giants and industrial challenges of our world today, and as we try to build our own modern reforms, what active safeguards do we need to demand right now? How do we ensure that the march of progress never, ever leaves minority communities behind again? The blueprint is sitting right there. But this time, it's completely up to us to make sure the doors of progress are open to absolutely everyone.